Good afternoon, namaskar. I would say this is the most difficult conversation of this summit because climate change does not have fun political one-liners. Climate change is not dramatic or urgent. Some 50 to 70 countries are going to polls this year. I'm not sure climate change is an election issue in even 5 of them. It's a footnote in most policy documents. It's everyone's problem, yet no one wants to solve it. Summers are getting hotter, winters are getting colder, freak weather is becoming more common, billions are being lost in economies the world over, climate refugees pose the next big challenge, and some countries face extinction. So what we want to ask today is, what will it take for us and our world to take climate change seriously? With me are two very well-qualified and eminent personalities to talk about this. Amina Gurib-Fakim, former President Mauritius, also a biodiversity scientist. And Eric Solheim, former Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme with an extensive career focusing on climate change. Welcome to Rising Bharat and to India. Amina Gurib-Fakim, the world is talking a lot more about climate change, but is this talk translating into policy and action? Are we doing better at mitigating the climate crisis than we were, say, 10 years ago?
Good morning, and again, Palki, thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure always to be back in India. I'm here in India, and we are heading precisely towards the COP29, which will be held in Baku this year. You've mentioned something very important, the climate crisis. I think we all acknowledge that climate change is a threat to the world, to our survival on this planet. And are we taking it seriously? If we are to look at the crisis, the COVID crisis, I think it gives us an idea. It's a harbinger of what's to come in the future. And what we find, of course, is that the concept, rather the narrative, is still shaped in the us and them. Us, me, you, 85% of the global population living in global south, and of course the 15% of the global north. We still haven't realized that we have one planet, there's no planet B. If we go back to the COPs, which have been, of course, the key institution looking at the climate crisis, we find that we still didn't seem to be able to get the consensus around this issue. The successful COP may have been the COP21 in Paris, when the NDCs were approved and countries realized that we have a common, but we need a differentiated approach. And this differentiated approach comes down to money, comes down to finance. And we still, as we speak now, so many years after Paris, we still haven't come to the consensus of capitalizing the $100 billion for helping adaptation. I'm not talking about mitigation, but I'm talking about adaptation. We have seen subsequently incremental narratives of the Bridgetown Initiative. We talk about the loss and damage funds, but still they remain empty boxes.
It becomes us versus them because someone has to fund climate action. Eric Solheim, and from where I'm seeing it, it's not a problem of money because there are governments that have poured billions of dollars into wars and the wars that suit them. So the money goes to Ukraine, but not necessarily to, say, the Sudan. So there is money. Is this a problem of lack of funds or lack of political will?
The money is not the problem. That's what people speak about in international conferences, but it's not really the problem. And the reason for that is very simple. The price of solar energy has fallen by 90% in 1 decade. The price of wind energy has fallen by 85% in 1 decade. So if today, if you make the shift from from coal or from fossil fuels into renewables, not only is good for the health, everyone knows, not only is good for Mother Earth, everyone knows, it's also very good for the economy. It's cheaper, and that's why the calculus of the past was a thing of the past. In the 20th century, if you wanted to grow the economy, there was no other way than coal. That's why Europe did it, America did it, China did it, and India started doing it. But today you can grow the economy by renewables, and frankly, this is why Prime Minister Modi is now leading India in the right direction. Because, mind you, he gets the big picture right. Prime Minister Modi understands that climate change and environment action is not a burden for India. It's an enormous opportunity. It's an opportunity for more jobs, getting people out of poverty, but doing it in a green way. And if I may add, maybe the best slogan I ever heard in India, Bharat, on this was Ola, the Uber of India, as you all know. They have a wonderful factory in Tamil Nadu, young Tamil ladies making electrical scooters, and the slogan is really captivating. It says, Tesla for the West, Ola for the rest. Because meaning that Bharat can get any number of jobs from moving into the green economy.
You make interesting points, and you were telling me earlier that you believe that Indian culture is the best suited for climate action. Do you want to tell our audience about that?
Sorry,
Indian culture, you said, is better suited.
Look, the old Brits had a, to put it mildly, very unfavorable view of the Hindu Dharma, or the traditional Indian culture. They saw it as a second-rate religion with any number, millions of gods, didn't take it seriously at all. Then switched to 2024, and Hindu Dharma looks like the most modern of all religions. Why? Because look, in Christianity, while there is a strong drive to protect nature in Christianity, still the perspective is always that the human being is superior. Human being is superior to nature. While in Hindu Dharma, man is part of nature. Man is in nature. And that now looks such a modern perspective. And the old Indians, they venerated nature. They did it even to the extent of making God half animal, half human. I mean, Ganesh, half elephant, half human, Hanuman, half monkey, half human. And can there be a stronger signal of the unity of man, humans, and nature than making God half nature, half human? So what the Brits spoke so negatively about 100 years ago is now looking as the most modern of all global thought systems.
That's a very interesting perspective. Amina, Hurib Fakim, your thoughts on what India is doing, and countries like India, even China, have developmental requirements. Same with Mauritius. As the president, I'm sure you've seen this firsthand, the challenges that climate change poses to you and your people. So you have to find a way to balance the two. How do you think these countries are doing?
First of all, I just pick up to what Eric has just said. The approach that the global south and India, Asia, of course, and China, I think the approach is that we are very much part of the ecosystem and that we need to start respecting nature, and the solutions will be, of course, in nature. But you mentioned something about the challenges of climate and how India and in most Asian countries, even China, are tackling. I think the plan is there. There is a game plan to address this. I think many of the rising emerging economies, of course, India is one of them, they have the plan. But I have a but. We are all integrated in the global economy. And this, of course, is the lifeblood of any country, is to see to it that trade increases so that jobs can be created. And my concern is that because of the competition, because of the moving geotectonic plates around the world, especially now that India and China are rising, is that there could be a break to this rise. And the break will come because when we start tying down trade to the climate. It's a good point, but there is a downside to it. It can become a break. I mean, also have to bring in Africa, because this is where I hail from, is that there will be a tendency to link up trade to cleaner technologies. And those countries that haven't played catch up, they will find big problems in terms of precisely benchmarking themselves to that level to see to it that trade happens. And that's what I fear will be the tendency moving forward. And I think this is where I think India, I'm sure, is already mindful of the way that she's going to progress in the future, because India is set to become, of course, now we are fifth, is going to be, of course, higher in the ranking of emerging economies. So this is something that has to be borne in mind.
You mentioned the the debate on who is going to take responsibility, and that also brings us to the point of historical responsibility, and there are countries that have contributed more to emissions. Do you think that's a valid point that the Global South makes, and do you feel let down by rich countries that do not put their money where their mouth is?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the continent of Africa, it has been less than 3% in terms of global emission. The Global North has been 25% as we speak. There has been an initiative to capitalize the fund, and here I make a pledge for more funds for adaptation. And where we are falling short is that the needs of the Global South, excluding China, is $1 trillion per year. And I don't see any country or any institution that is able to actually match and bring forward this amount of fund. So this will be the race. And again, the 100 billion which has come on board since Paris hasn't been capitalized. We still have a gap. And if you look at 100 billion in the world global economy of 100 trillion, it's not a lot. But I don't see the will or the appetite to take this risk to help poorer countries adapt. And this is where we are failing, because the future of the world will depend on the growth in the Global South. And of course, the prosperity in Global South matters. If you take one item like immigration, we find that how much this is impacting, of course, the Global North and, of course, the Global South economies.
Is it domestic politics, Eric Solheim, that impacts this? Because we've seen climate deniers take high offices. We've seen the former US president who's in the race again. We've seen others. We've seen that when governments change, and now we're looking at many elections across the world, some regimes come with more intense and focused climate policies and others do not. And we know that climate action requires consistency. So do you think domestic politics plays a role, and how can we change that?
Look, first of all, of course, no one should blame India or the Global South for climate change. The emissions of the United States of America up to this point are 25 times Indian emissions per capita. So stop blaming the Global South. By the way, American emissions are also 8 times Chinese emissions per capita. So get that out of the picture. The one thing the environment movement gets wrong, in my view, is it sometimes framing the message as a message for the young and trendy. But the message cannot be just for the young and trendy in Mumbai or Bengaluru. It must also be for the farmer in Uttar Pradesh, or for the coal worker in Jharkhand, or for the housewife in Telangana. I mean, it must be for the people. And the message is sometimes also so incredibly boring, it doesn't really work. So we need a better messaging to the people. And we need to do it much more about the love for nature, make it a lot more fun, a lot more exciting, and maybe the most important of all, get out the message that the green transformation is a help to the people. It's not a cost. It's an enormous achievement. Let me just give a few examples from India itself. In Gujarat Desert, the Adani Group is now building the biggest individual solar and wind plant in the world. It's as much energy as all the hydropower consumption of my nation, Norway, and we are fully fueled by hydropower at a very, very high level of consumption. That one plant is as much as we consume overall in Norway. Then, in Omkareshwar, in Madhya Pradesh, at the Narmada River, L&T and Hartex Solar and other companies are building the biggest floating solar in the world. Amazing. It's as much as 4 times the most controversial hydropower plant, again, in my nation, Norway. So it's big. And when Prime Minister Modi came back from Ayodhya, from the Ram Mandir, his first step was to say, look, Ram was about energy. Can I serve the people of India better than launching an initiative for 1 crore, 10 million rooftop solar? The initiative is already out there. Go into the internet and Google it and look into whether you can apply for it yourself. So, and of course, all these are beneficial to the people, creating jobs, creating prosperity, and making sure that India do not need to pay for oil from Norway or from Russia or from Saudi Arabia, but can use the money for the people back home. But we need to change the conversation from a very boring, very centered on a few young people in the city conversation, to this amazing conversation of how all people, also farmers and workers, everyone will benefit from the green transformation.
So change the conversation. That's an interesting point again. Amina Gurib Fakim, we cannot talk about climate change and not mention big oil. And it's interesting that the last COP summit was hosted by one of the biggest oil producers in the world. There is again a debate on whether we should co-opt them, and can petrodollars meaningfully fund green transition? Is that the only way forward now?
Palki, there is a lot of conversation about oil. And I think last COP in Dubai, they had big problem actually getting the wordings right in terms of phasing out oil. And unfortunately, if we call them down to brass tack, it will be difficult to phase out oil immediately. But I think what we can get from the oil industry is precisely their CSR in terms of capitalizing the global funds to be able to help countries adapt. And I think this is where we make a pledge, because we are in election year in the United States, in India, in many of the major countries. We are going to go for election. So capitalizing the Green Fund will not be a priority for many countries. We are, of course, running out of time, but we make a pledge to the big corporations. And this is where the SDGs make a difference vis-à-vis the MDGs, because this is where we call for the contribution of the private sector. So if the private sector can help come on board and help capitalize the fund and help us reach this $1 trillion so that this global south can help adapt, because again, I will say, the global north depend on the global south because we provide the branch on which we are all sitting for our own survival. So it's in our interest to fund the funds to help adapt, because mitigation is already happening.
Also, COP summits tend to have a very big participation, 70,000 in the Dubai summit, which I understand that they want to bring more voices on board, but it makes consensus that much more difficult. You mentioned the private sector. There's increasingly a pitch with sustainable products that are being pushed out in the market. Do you think that it's just window dressing as of now? Do you think that there is a serious commitment where the private sector is concerned, that they want to make a difference and become part of climate change, climate action?
So far, there have remained pledges, and the pledges haven't been translated into solid dollars. But I think when you look at a country like India, for example, which has a very big agriculture base, while we actually lambast agriculture as being an emitter, I think India can play a key role in transforming the ag sector into a net absorber. And with these tools that India can bring in terms of technology, and India has got very strong institutions in terms of addressing this, I think it can be a great boon in terms of addressing the climate crisis and become a net absorber and also create jobs. And here I have a special plea to make, because agriculture also means women, and we need to empower women to bring them on board to become these game changers in terms of addressing the climate crisis.
Eric Solheim, I have some data. Gen Z, 81% of them, according to a survey, the young generation, said that they were very concerned about climate change, and they've talked about climate anxiety. Another set talks about the multiplication of climate-related litigation. People are taking their governments to court. What is your message to the youth? Do you think that making climate action legally binding and forcing policymakers to look at this is the only way forward now?
I mean, all in favor of that. I mean, cannot agree more than to any global agreement which will enforce regulations on climate. However, there is no need to wait for that, because acting on climate in India or any other place is creating more jobs, saving money on the budget, and creating a much healthier and better society. So there's no need to wait for someone else. But if I may, since we come maybe to the close of the conversation, also make a couple of challenges to India, and what are the main issues India need to work on to do even better. I think one is still red tape. It takes too long to get permissions for renewable energies. That's, by the way, not just an Indian problem. It's a massive problem in the United States, in Europe, everywhere. one of the biggest wind makers in Europe, told me, look, it takes a lot longer to get the permission to construct offshore wind than it actually takes to, put up the windmills. And I think one reason why a state like Gujarat seems to be front in the lead in India, maybe that they got the relationship to business right at an early stage. It's a more efficient system, a more business-friendly system. Tamil Nadu is also in the lead, maybe for some of the similar reasons. So cutting red tape is central. And the other, which may not be so popular to talk about in India, is the relationship to China. Because China is 60% of everything green in the entire world. Don't look to the West. They're far behind India. The only nation in the world which may be ahead of India is China. China has 60% of wind, solar, hydropower, electric cars, electric batteries, high-speed rail, whatever you look to, China is dominating.
I think I'm going to interrupt there.
Just one second on that. So the relationship between China and India is key, because tapping into this technology for India, while at the same time onshoring the jobs here. I mean, people in Bharat need jobs, so that is a first-rate issue for the development of renewables.
India-China is a whole different conversation. Time is up, but I want one last word from you, your message to climate deniers.
Climate is happening, climate change is happening, and I think all the indicators are pointing to this. But what I would like to see is more power, more technology, more finance to help us all together ride the tide, because its time is running against us. And let's empower the youth, because I think it's their planet at the end of the day. So we need to empower them. We need to empower women so as to actually bring on board the changes that we'd like to see. Thank you.
Right. As they say, we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change, and we may be the last generation that can do something about it. Thank you very much for your thoughts and for being here today. What is the driving force of decision-making today? Is it realism? Is it power? Is it morals? Or is it a mix of everything? Also, where does India stand in this mix? What role will India play in the looming conflicts of this century? We look forward to exploring all of this with you, Professor Mearsheimer. Welcome to Bharat Rising. My first question to you is, what would you call the current world order? How would you describe it? Would you say it's still unipolar, with America in the lead? Would you say it's truly multipolar? How would you see this?
I believe that the world today is multipolar. Most of you in the audience came of age during the unipolar moment, which ran from roughly 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, up until about 2017. And the United States was, of course, the most powerful state on the planet by far during the unipolar moment. But by 2017, roughly 2017, Vladimir Putin had rescued Russia from the dead, and Russia was back as a great power. And China, because of all of the economic growth that had taken place during the 1990s and the first 17 years of the 21st century, was also a great power. So we're now in a system where there are three great powers: the United States, China, and Russia.
What about India? Where do you see India standing in this? And do you see India then as a bridging power, trying to bridge different ideological camps? Or is India just tilting things in the direction that suit it?
Well, I would say, first of all, India is an aspiring great power. The two building blocks of power in the international system are population size and wealth. You need a great deal of wealth, and you need a lot of people to qualify as a great power. The reason that China was not considered a great power until recently was because it didn't have the wealth. It certainly had the population size. What China now has is population size plus wealth. What India has for sure is population size, and it's growing wealthier and wealthier by the year. But I think, according to most accounts, it has not yet reached the point where it qualifies as a great power. Nevertheless, there is no question that India is a major power, and it is, in a very important way, caught in between those three great powers, because India has all sorts of potential problems with China, mainly revolving around the border between those two countries. India has very close relations with both Russia and the United States, and from the American point of view, that causes problems because the Americans don't want India to have good relations with Russia. But of course, from India's point of view, it makes good sense to have good relations with Russia. So relations between India and the United States have been somewhat testy. They've been very good in terms of relations with Russia. And the question of China is, I think, a looming problem for India. But nevertheless, the world that India operates in now is very complicated, and India is going to have a complicated task moving forward dealing with this world.
Is another way of looking at it this, that India is best poised to make to make the most of this complicated situation because India can talk to and do business with all camps?
I think at some point India will have to make some hard choices. I think the most interesting question is what happens between India, China, and the United States. My sense is that China will continue to grow more powerful, that it will build a potent blue water navy, and it will try to project power into the Persian Gulf, and it will therefore move through the Indian Ocean, and this will not make the Indians happy and will push the Americans and the Indians closer together.
In the event of a conflict between India and China, do you think Russia will be forced to take a side?
I think if there were a conflict between India and China, the Russians would do everything they could to sit on the fence and to not get committed. The Russians have no interest in having bad relations with either China or India. So if there was, and hopefully there will not be, a conflict between India and China, I think the Russians would do everything they could to stay far away.
You've said in the past that great powers will always seek hegemony or dominance over others. You say that India is an aspiring great power. When it does become a great power, do you think I would do the same? Because I've seen any or any of the rhetoric that comes with these hegemonic tendencies?
My basic view of international politics is that the ideal situation is to be a hegemon in your region of the world and to make sure that there's no other hegemon on the planet. And I basically argue that the United States is the only regional hegemon in the world. It's a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States goes to great lengths to make sure that no other country dominates its region the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And that's why in the 20th century, we played a key role in putting Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union on the scrap heap of history. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. At the same time, I believe it makes eminently good sense for China to dominate Asia. I think that as China grows more powerful economically, it will try to dominate Asia. And I think from China's point of view, that makes good sense. From America's point of view, it does not make good sense. And certainly from India's point of view, it does not make good sense for China to dominate Asia. Just one final point. I would argue that if India were to grow more powerful than China, and the Chinese economy were to falter, and India's economy was to take off, and India looked like it could dominate Asia, it would try to dominate Asia. Not because of Indian culture or Indian politics, because that's just the way great power politics work. the best way to survive in the international system is to be really powerful.
Interesting. Let's talk about the Ukraine war now. And you've accused the West of poking the Russian bear. It's been 2 years. It's a frozen conflict. No side is making much headway. And Putin has won a record 5th term in power. How do you see this war ending? And what do you think the West should do? Should they stop military aid to Ukraine?
I believe that it's actually not a frozen conflict. I believe that the Russians are winning the war and that the Russians will end up with an ugly victory. I believe the Russians now control about 20% of Ukrainian territory. The balance of power has shifted decisively in Russia's favor in terms of both weaponry and manpower, which are of great importance in a war of attrition like the one you see taking place in Ukraine. And what I think is going to happen is that the Russians will end up conquering about 40% of Ukrainian territory. I think they now have annexed 4 oblasts plus the Crimea. My guess is, and I want to underline that this is just my guess, is that they will end up annexing 4 more oblasts, and they will end up with 40%, roughly 40% of Ukrainian territory. And what will be left is a dysfunctional rump state. Ukraine, in other words, will be a dysfunctional rump state that the Russians will go to great lengths over time to make sure is politically and economically weak so that it cannot become a part of NATO. But that, I think, is the likely outcome.
That's the military end that you're talking about. What about the political end? Do you think Ukraine will end up joining the NATO?
No, I think politically the Russians will go to great lengths to make sure Ukraine doesn't join NATO. And I think that the West will not bring a dysfunctional Ukraine into the alliance. So I think that it will not, Ukraine will not become part of NATO.
Do you then think the West should stop the military aid to Ukraine? Because the American aid is tied in the Congress and the Europeans are still struggling to find the money to fund this war.
Yes, this is a great question. I believe that it is best for Ukraine, and I want to underline that. I believe it is best for Ukraine to now end the war, to reach a settlement with the Russians. And that means 2 things. One, Ukraine must sever all of its security relations with the West, not just give up entering NATO. Ukraine should become a truly neutral state by severing its military or security ties with the West, because Russia's principal concern is the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. That, the Russians say, to a person is an existential threat, and they do not accept that. So I think it's imperative that Ukraine become a neutral state. And then the other thing is, I think it's very important that the United States cut off all assistance to Ukraine and that the Europeans collectively provide aid, economic aid, not military aid, to Ukraine moving forward until it gets on its feet.
I'll come to the question of the aid in a bit, but you've said that Ukraine should become a neutral state, and you've argued in the past against NATO expansion to the east. The argument from the other side is that that's not a choice for Russia to make, which side Ukraine should go to. That's not something that Moscow gets to decide. Plus, recent polls have said that close to 70% Ukrainians want to be part of the NATO. So there is realism, and then there is public opinion. And in most quote-unquote democracies, leaders are swayed by public opinion. So if Ukrainians want to join the NATO, what should the leadership do?
Well, the thing is that Ukraine, for obvious reasons, at this point, would like to join NATO. But this would be a fundamental mistake, because if they join or try to join NATO, their country is going to be wrecked. If Ukraine had never made any attempt to join NATO, Ukraine would be intact today. Crimea would be part of Ukraine. Those 4 oblasts that have been already annexed to Russia would still be part of Ukraine. This war is all about NATO expansion into Ukraine. If the West had not pushed hard to bring Ukraine into NATO, starting in 2008, there would have been no major crisis in 2014, there would have been no war in 2022, and Ukraine would be intact. So the argument that Ukraine has a right as a sovereign democracy to join NATO makes people feel good when they hear that, because we love to talk about rights in the West. But the fact is, talking about the right to join NATO and pushing Ukraine to join NATO has led to the destruction of NATO. And in my personal opinion, that is a horrendous disaster.
Yes, and Russia's war has also led to the expansion of NATO. In the last 2 years, we've seen 2 countries join. But you talked about the West stopping military aid, America stopping military aid to Ukraine. If and when that happens, what message would it send to other players, for instance, a Xi Jinping? What would stop him from seeing a Ukraine in Taiwan?
There's this argument that if the United States cuts and runs or loses in Ukraine, that this will have significant effects in East Asia, because Xi Jinping will think that the United States won't fight in East Asia if China behaves aggressively. I do not believe for 1 second that Xi Jinping or the Chinese elite thinks that the United States, for example, will not fight over Taiwan. Joe Biden has said on 4 separate occasions that the United States will fight for Taiwan. There is no doubt in my mind that the United States will fight for Taiwan, because Taiwan is of great strategic importance to the United States, and the United States, as I said earlier in my comments, is determined to contain China. So I do not believe that losing in Ukraine, and I want to be clear here, I do think the United States is in the process of losing in Ukraine. I do not think it will weaken our deterrent position in East Asia vis-a-vis the Chinese.
The thing is that we do not know for sure that Joe Biden will be around until the end of this year to make that decision vis-a-vis Taiwan. Having said that, do you think that Xi Jinping is going to attack Taiwan in this decade?
No, I don't think that Xi Jinping is going to attack Taiwan anytime soon. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One of the main reasons is that for him or for China to attack Taiwan, it has to cross a large body of water. And amphibious operations are among the most difficult military operations you can ask an army to perform. It is very difficult to cross a body of water as large as the Taiwan Strait. So the task that the Chinese have set for themselves, if they decide to attack Taiwan, would be a formidable one. The second point is, China has not fought a war since 1979. Just think about that. The United States of America is fighting wars all the time. The United States has a highly primed military. It's primed for combat. The Chinese military has not fought a war in a long time. It's a rusty military. And we know from watching how the Russians performed in Ukraine in the early stages of that war, armies take time to get used to fighting wars, to fighting battles. You just don't take an army that hasn't fought a war in a long time and send it into battle and expect it to do well. So what I'm telling you here is that the Chinese would have to perform an extremely difficult military task launching an amphibious operation across the Taiwan Strait, number one. And number two, they don't have a highly tuned military that can perform that difficult task.
So logic says that China will not attack, but leaders do not always operate on logic, and the region is a powder keg, so there's always the possibility of conflict breaking out. If that happens, my question is, what role do you see India playing there? Because India controls the entry to the Malacca Strait. India has an agreement with the US to allow the aircraft to refuel at Indian bases. Do you think India will have a role, and will it support America militarily in a Taiwan conflict?
My sense is that if a conflict were to break out, it would not break out over Taiwan for the reasons that I just stipulated. I think the most dangerous area in East Asia is the South China Sea, and I would not be surprised if a conflict broke out between the Philippines and China and the United States got dragged in, which then goes to your question, what would India do? I think that India in that event would provide indirect support for the United States. I don't think that India would get involved in the fighting. I think if conflict broke out at a low level, the Americans would pretty much handle it by themselves, maybe with the Philippines by their side in the fight. If it escalated into a larger war, I think the Japanese, South Koreans, and Australians would be likely to come in before the Indians. But it is possible that India would come in. The problem that India faces is that it has to protect its home waters, and it has to protect its border with China. And I think the last thing India is going to be anxious to do is join the fight and get into a war with with China. I think it's in India's advantage in the scenario that you described to provide indirect assistance to the Americans and do as little as possible to help the Americans. That will not make the Americans happy, but that I think is in India's national interest.
You mentioned the Chinese economy, and they're not in the best phase. They have way too many challenges. The world is talking about decoupling, de-risking, friendshoring. Do you think Xi Jinping revealed his hand too soon, that he should have waited for a few more years before openly challenging the US?
There's no question that it was in China's interest, as Deng Xiaoping pointed out many, many years ago, for China to rise as quietly as possible and not in any way threaten the Americans. And I believe that the Chinese, by and large, tried to do that. But the problem is that the United States eventually came to see that China was growing economically and militarily more powerful. And we started telling ourselves stories about how China might end up being a really formidable military foe. Now you want to remember, this is very important, when the United States started to pursue a policy of engagement towards China in the early 1990s, which was designed to make China rich, we believed that China would eventually become a democracy. And when it became a democracy, it would get along very well with other democracies, like the United States, like India, like Japan, because democracies never fight against each other in the story that we told ourselves. Now, I want to be clear. I don't believe that story, but the vast majority of foreign policy experts in the West do believe that story. But the problem in that story is that China did not become a democracy. So what happened here is it got richer and richer. It began to build larger military forces. And even though it didn't, in my opinion, do much to provoke the Americans, the mere fact that it wasn't a democracy, combined with all that military might that it was developing, force the Americans to abandon engagement and move to a containment policy.
The funny thing is that China does call itself a democracy with Chinese characteristics. But you've said in the past that the US foolishly fed the economic rise of China. The US is now working very closely with India. Do you foresee a potential rivalry with India in the future?
No, just to go back to the Chinese-American case, as some of you remember, in the early Cold War, China and the Soviet Union were on one side and the Americans were on the other. And then starting with Nixon and Kissinger in the early 70s, we brought the Chinese over to our side. So it was the Americans and the Chinese versus the Soviet Union. During that second half of the Cold War, we had a vested interest in helping China to get rich, because as China got rich, it helped us contain the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union went away, my argument is we no longer have a vested interest in helping China to get rich. Now, let's go to the India question. At this point in time, the United States has a deep-seated interest in seeing India grow wealthier and militarily more powerful, because India can help the United States contain China. India is a member of the Quad. If China develops a powerful naval projection capability into the Gulf area, India will play a key role in helping the United States deal with that scenario. So we have a vested interest in helping India grow. If, however, China at some point in the future goes the way of the Soviet Union, China breaks up, it's much weaker tomorrow than it is today, and India continues to grow more and more powerful, you can rest assured the United States will put its gun sights on India.
All I can say is that American policymakers do not learn from their own history. They also supported the rise of Pakistan to counterbalance India, and that did not go very well. We're out of time, but I have to ask you one last question. How do you see the Gaza war ending? We know that you've criticized Israel's actions very strongly, which is also a contrast with how you see Palestine versus Ukraine. But how do you see the end to this conflict?
I think the Gaza war, from Israel's point of view, is a disaster. It's very important to understand that Israel conquered Gaza in 1967. And after the 1967 war, Israel ended up with the West Bank and with Gaza. And they built some settlements in Gaza after 1967, and they stationed military forces in Gaza after 1967. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, who was a super hawkish individual and who was prime minister of Israel at the time, pulled all of the Israeli settlements and the Israeli military out of Gaza and basically turned it into a giant open-air prison. But there were no Israeli settlements or military forces inside of Gaza, because Sharon understood that was not in Israel's national interest, because Gaza was like a hornet's nest for the Israelis. Well, if you look at what's happened as a result of October 7th, the Israelis are back in Gaza. They have large-scale military forces there, and they plan to stay there. At the same time, there is virtually no chance that Israel is going to defeat Hamas. So they are going to have significant resistance from Hamas. They're stuck in Gaza, and world opinion, and this includes countries like India, which favor the two-state solution, and the United States, which favors the two-state solution, are going to put enormous pressure on Israel over time to move to a two-state solution, which Israel doesn't want to do. All of this is to say, Israel is in real trouble.
I have a lot of questions, but we are completely out of time. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights.